the night acquired his catchbox. God alone knows how or when. Jenny Tyler, she turned up lately with a knife stuck through her breast, while McHeath walks the embankment, nonchalantly unimpressed, and the gas blaze firing so low, 7 children at a blow. In the crowd stands Mac the knife, but he isn't asked, he doesn't know. And the child bride in her nightgown, whose assailants still at large, violated in her slumbers. Maggie, how much did you charge? Yes, the child bride in her nightgown, her assailants still at large, violated in her slumbers. Maggie, how much did you charge? Maggie, how much did you charge? 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 How much did you charge?
I was looking for your name on the
Credits.
okay. Why don't you come on up here, Herb, and
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Okay, you saw quiz show, and let me just get a little sense of the audience. What percentage of this movie do you think is actually true?
90%?
How much did you say?
90%?
Let's come down a little.
Oh.
50%?
Way down.
10%.
No. It ranges anywhere between about 30 to 40%. This is what's called a docudrama. In other words, there's a kernel of truth to this thing, and the events didn't happen, obviously, as they're shown. It's a screenwriter and Redford's version of what happened. These events really stretched over a period of 3 years, but otherwise it would have made a terribly sprawling movie. So what they do is they condensed everything into like a couple of weeks. First of all, needless to say, I mean, I was played so far over the top by Turturro. This is what the director wanted. Let me tell you about a little incident that happened. My first wife, Toby, who you see in this movie, incidentally knew about this thing from the first get-go, when Enright came to my house and he offered to give me $25,000 if I'd come on the show. I knew it was a rigged show from the get-go. Let me tell you the whole sequence here. Back in 1956, I'm a World War II veteran, #1. I spent 7 years in the service. I was in World War II and the Korean War for part of the time. I came out of the service in 1952, went to work at the post office for 2 years, and then went back to college, back to CCNY. What happened then was in 1956, I had gotten married to Toby in 1955, 54 rather, and In 1956, I was sitting in my house and I saw this program for the first time. And I've been a trivia buff all my life, and I have an exceptionally retentive memory. I wrote a letter telling them that I was a World War II vet, that I had thousands and thousands of facts and figures at my fingertips, and I'd like to be a contestant on their show. I was invited down to Barry and Enright's office on Madison Avenue, not in the RCA building like it's shown here, and there was a 3.5-hour trivia test comprised of some of the hardest questions I ever saw in my life, such as, what was the name of the first American soldier killed in France in World War I? That was one of the questions. Or what's the width of a football field goalpost? And 359 other incredibly hard questions. At any rate, I scored 252 right out of this, which is the highest that anybody ever scored on this program. And I was invited to come back several weeks later and given a 2-hour interview. They asked me all about myself and threw questions at me. Jack Barry was not present at this thing. Dan Enright was, a producer named Robert Noah, and a guy named Howard Merrill, another producer of the show. And I was told to go home and I'd be contacted. Several weeks later, my wife, Toby, was at the movies. So she went to see Anastasia. In the meantime, the phone rang. Enright called and he said, "I'd like to have you come into Manhattan." Now, here's the thing. You remember my son Lester in this movie?
Yes.
The drummer?
Yes.
My son's real name is Harvey, and he's only 1.5 years old at this time. I have no son named Lester. This is what I'm driving at. This is Hollywood. This is the screenwriter's conception, and that's what happens. At any rate, I told him I was babysitting and I couldn't come into Manhattan to his office, and he came out of the Forest Hills about 3/4 of an hour later, and he plopped himself down in my living room on the couch, and he pulled out an attaché case and pulled out a bunch of category cards out of it, and he started to ask me a whole bunch of questions. I knew the answer to most of the questions, and the ones I didn't know, he supplied the answers. Then he leaned back in the couch and he said to me, "How would you like to make $25,000? And I said to him, "Who wouldn't, you know?" And I immediately understood what he was telling me. You don't hand out 25 grand. Don't forget, at this time, in 1956, when this event really took place, not 1958, $50 a week was the average salary at that time, and 25 grand was a hell of a lot of money. At any rate, once I said who wouldn't, it was agreed that I was going to take part in this game show, you know, on a fixed basis. He went to my wardrobe. He found an old boxy suit that had belonged to my late father-in-law. You see this depicted in the movie, incidentally. And he then went and selected a frayed blue and white shirt from my drawer, the worst looking tie he could possibly find, and he said, "Do you have a watch that makes noise?" And I said, "Yes, I have an old Timex." And he made me wear this watch on the program, in other words, to tick in the isolation booth, to make a lot of noise, in other words, to build up the suspense. Then he told me to get a white wall haircut, like a Marine type haircut, and I was rigged up to be the nerd, the square, the human computer, in other words, a person who was a one-dimension personality, and this is the way I was presented. What do you notice about the way everybody addressed Jack Barry? They all called him Jack, right? I'm the only person on the show that was required to call him Mr. Barry, and not even use my regular voice. I was to put on a plaintive voice saying something like, "I'll take 4 points, Mr. Barry." I actually had, in other words, to sum it up, I was not really a game show contestant. I was a highly paid actor for the time. At any rate, I was told to be at his office. When my wife came home, when Toby came home, I told her, Enright was in the apartment. He came and offered me $25,000. I'm going on tomorrow, and the game show is fixed. And so she knew from the get-go, in other words, contrary to what's shown in the picture. At any rate, I went to Enright's office the next day, and he asked me a bunch of questions. I knew most of the answers. The ones I didn't know, he supplied, and he introduced me to what is known as the Dan Enright School of Acting. For example, as you see in the movie, he taught you to pat your brow rather than make it. Don't forget, contrary to seeing the Peacock in the NBC offices, they didn't have color television at that time. They had regular television, you know, black and white, and these were kinescopes. What you saw was what you got. There was no editing. If you flubbed on the program, you flubbed in front of 50 million people. Incidentally, the program was not on Monday in prime time. It happened to have been on Wednesday night at 10:30 p.m., and still they drew an audience of 50 million people. There's a poster which came out at that time, which had a great tagline on it, which said, 50 million people were watching this and nobody saw a thing. I think you all understand what that meant. At any rate, I came down to his office, as I said, we ran through the thing, and he said, you answer, the first round you're gonna take a 9-point question and then an 8-point question. And I said to him, what happens then? He says, you'll be pleasantly surprised. I came on late in the show after other contestants had gone off, and within 7 or 8 minutes, I won $9,000. That was like a whole pile of money to me. And from there on in, every Wednesday afternoon, I would come down prior to the show being on, and we'd run through all these sessions. Incidentally, one day while I was rehearsing with him, Jack Barry happened to scramble into the room asking him something, and we had a whole bunch of category cards on the table. Enright pushed them into his desk very rapidly, and I looked at him after Barry left, and I said, doesn't he know what's going on? And Enright said to me, shut up and pay attention to your lessons. At any rate, I went on and on and on, and ultimately, contrary to the restaurant scene, incidentally, one thing I have to assure you about, I am not an idiot savant. Like the restaurant scene where I was told that I was plateauing, never happened, obviously. You don't sit and conspire in restaurants. And certainly I'm not an idiot savant where if you ask me the number 23, I'll tell you the 23rd, blah, 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 blah. This is the screenwriter, once again, of course. At any rate, the way it really happened was I came to his office, you know, ready to go on the show that evening. He drew on a chalkboard, he drew a line going up and then across and then coming down. He said, Herb, he says, you've plateaued, he says, and we're going to have to ask you to leave the show. Obviously, I was very disappointed. I was very hurt. You know, I had built up their ratings and so forth, and all of a sudden he was dumping me. I said, what happens? I said, what have you got to offer me? And he said to me, I'll tell you, he says, if you take the dive, if you agree to lose, I'll offer you 3 things, and that's what you see here in the movie, but they never tell you what they were. Number 1, he was going to make me, after I graduated college, he was going to make me a question consultant on his show. In other words, writing the questions and answers for 21, and that was supposed to pay me $250 a week, which is 5 times more than the average salary at that time. He offered me a shot on The Tonight Show. It was the Steve Allen show at that time. That was prior to Jack Parr and, of course, Johnny Carson and, of course, Jay Leno today. He also told me he was going to make me a contestant on a panel show. All this, of course, never materialized, and that's why I went public. Now, people ask me constantly, Herb, why didn't you just answer Marty? It was a movie I had seen 3 times. I obviously knew the answer. This was actually 1956 in December, and the Academy Awards were in March of that year, and I certainly would have remembered, 9 months before what picture had won. But as you see, the whole idea was throwing a sop to the public. In other words, people would say something like this: gee, this guy knows who the 6 wives of Henry VIII was, what their fate was, he knows this and that, but he doesn't know something as easy as what picture won the Academy Award last year, but I know it. That's exactly what they did. The same with Van Doren, if you remember, in the movie, making a cinch question. And this was, as I said before, a sop to the public. All right, at any rate, I went off the air. I went to see Enright several months later, and I said, you promised me this and you promised me that. I graduated from college, I said, and I'm ready to go to work for you. He looked at me and he said to me, I don't know what you're talking about. At that point, I made up my mind. I might go down myself, but I was going to destroy this guy. I mean, this is really what led to the quiz show scandals, although it wasn't my particular... I told this incidentally to 2 or 3 newspapers, but they refused to print it. I had a whole story, but they wouldn't print it because they were afraid of libel suits. Now, common sense tells you if they're giving you the questions and answers, they must know what the person in the other isolation booth is doing, because they can't tell you to take 8 or 9 points without knowing what your opponent is going to do. So it's a no-brainer that you should know that the other person's got to be rigged too. I mean, I think we'll all agree on that, won't we? You certainly can't say take 8 points and then take 9 points unless they know what the other contestant's doing. But they made such a big deal about it in this movie, that maybe they gave him the answers, but not me, which of course is insulting to your intelligence. At any rate, I took the dive, as I told before. I told the newspapers about it, they wouldn't publish. At any rate, the real scandal started off when a contestant on a program called Dotto in 1958, it was a daytime show. It involved connecting the dots based on clues that were given to you by the MC. At any rate, this guy, Eddie Hilgemeyer, happened to be sitting in the green room. That's the little preparation room where you go to preparing for the program. And he sees a notebook on a stool. And he opens up this notebook. He's watching this woman, Marie Wynn, on the program, answering the exact questions that are listed in the notebook, and he was fit to be tied. He went to the Federal Communications Commission with an attorney about this, and they refused to do anything about this. So he went to the New York City District Attorney's office in Manhattan. That was Frank Hogan, was the district attorney at that time, and Richard Goodwin, incidentally, contrary to what the movie shows, had very little to do with any of this stuff here. The actual case was conducted by an ADA who just passed away several years ago, Joseph Stone. Joe Stone handled this particular case, ultimately became a judge, and died at 82 a few months ago. Well, after the Dotto business and the district attorney picking on it, they said anybody who has any knowledge about game show rigging step forward. I made the fateful call, and I went down there. They interviewed me and so forth. I told them my whole story. And all of a sudden, the very newspapers which had refused to publish my story came out with banner headlines saying, "Program rigged," and whose byline do you think was on there? Not a reporter, but Herb Stempel's. In other words, the story by Herb Stempel. They sat on this, in other words, for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and did nothing about it.
Herb, can I ask, do you think they did that for legal reasons in case?
That's what they claim. They claim that they were afraid of libel suits. But you can't have a libel suit if you're telling the truth. But this, I think, finally, when it broke, was a chance, because television had been wiping the floor with the print media, and here was their chance to get back at television by printing the story, exposing this thing as a sham. At any rate, I did testify that before the committee, this part, and they're showing me fussing over my television tie and all this other neurotic sort of stuff is obviously a bunch of neurotic nonsense. First of all, there couldn't be a television tie because there was no color. It was black and white. And my wife, incidentally, who passed away in 1980, was never in Washington with me. I was there alone. I was there without an attorney. I told my story. I didn't need an attorney. I was telling the truth. And then I went home. Ultimately, you know, it came about where they had to summon Charles Van Doren. I didn't have to sneak in between people's legs to get into the hearing room. And incidentally, do you think this thing was really shot in Washington? The answer is no. The New York Historical Society on 77th Street in Central Park West went belly up and needed a financial infusion. Robert Redford negotiated with the New York Historical Society, paid him $60,000 for a month's rental on the library, and that's where this confession scene was actually shot. The confession actually was much more than just a confession and walking out. What happened was they did question him for about a half hour or so, and people, these congressmen you see here, actually made these statements. These are verbatim statements made by these congressmen until Steve Deroonian, who happens to be quite alive as far as I know at this moment, it must be about 92 by now, a conservative Republican from Nassau County made the statement about telling the truth, finally telling the truth. Incidentally, the part in there is played by a guy named Joe Atanasio, who's the father of the screenwriter, Paul Atanasio, the guy that wrote the script for this thing. These are just little odds and ends. I've told you before I didn't have a son named Lester. My first wife, Toby, died, as I said, in 1980. My present wife, Ethel, is a very feisty woman. I'll tell you a very funny anecdote about what happened. The premiere of this show, I had already seen a pre-screening in August 29, 1994. On September 14th was the premiere at the Ziegfeld Theater on 54th Street. They sent a stretch limo for my wife and me. We came down there, and the paparazzi were in full force. My picture was snapped a few hundred times. Came up there, sat in the balcony, and Ethel sat to the left of me. There was an older woman and a younger woman sitting to the right of me. At the end of the show, I was quite miffed by the performance, of course, because it certainly is not me. Turturro was instructed by Redford to play it far over the top, you know, and it certainly isn't Herb Stempel. At any rate, at the end of the show, the younger woman tapped me and pointed to the older woman and said, "This is Martin Scorsese's mother." And I said, "Pleased to meet you, I'm Herb Stempel." We walked out into the foyer, and Turturro was standing out there with 6 suits, who I didn't know from the proverbial hole in the head. At any rate, he walked over towards me and he said, "Herb, if you punched me in the nose, I'd understand why." And I met John for about 5 hours. I met him at the producer's house for dinner once in upstate New York, and I met him at the job. I still work, incidentally, for the Department of Transportation in the legal division, and I go to court. But at any rate, I didn't want any problems. I was miffed, you know, but why create a scene? So I said, "No, John, everything's copacetic." My wife, Ethel, was wearing a short-sleeved dress at the time, and she pretended to roll up her sleeves and said, "Step aside, Herb, I want to take a crack at him." And everybody, all the suits just completely broke up, including John. I mean, it was really a very funny scene. I sit, as I told you before, I work for the city, and I sit at what are known as examinations before trial. I just turned 79. I'm heading for my 80th birthday, but I still like to work. And at any rate, I sit opposite lawyers all the time, and most of the attorneys, you know, negligence lawyers know me. I come and I testify at court and at these examinations before trial, and occasionally, you know, a new attorney will say something to me like, "Are you the real Herb Stempel?" And my answer is always, "Well, I'm certainly not John Turturro." That always gets a big laugh.
If I could jump in here for a second. Some of you guys may have to go to another class. I would like to continue this for as long as you want to, you would like.
I haven't got too much to tell.
Okay, I want to see if anybody has any questions also. If you have to slip out to another class, please slip out
All
quietly.
right, let me just, all right, I think I've said my piece. Do we have any questions?
I have a question about, well, a comment and then a question. I think some of the artistic license taken in the film is to make a larger statement about the media. And I think that some of the symbolism there is to say something about the characters. For example, about an hour into the film, when Van Doren is going out on the boat. That, I think, is part symbolizing, that's the first time he's actually not just sitting idly by and saying nothing. That's the first time he actually is proactive about the deception. Now, your son, who we know is fictionalized, the idea of him playing the drums as a hobby, practicing the drums.
That's true, incidentally. My son,
Oh, really?
Yeah, my son Harvey did play the drums. As a matter of fact, from a legal standpoint, when they made the movie, my son is a PhD in psychology, lives in Maryland. He had to sign a waiver allowing them to use the name Lester and presenting him as an 8-year-old kid. You know, the legal people took care of that. As I said before, you know, every time people meet me, they say to me, "Gee, you're nothing like you're portrayed in the movie," and the point is, it's Hollywood. I understand this. That's why I'm telling you it's about 40% true, and the rest is the screenwriter's conception. Let me just tell you 1 or 2 short anecdotes, and then I'll be done. I was on, if you notice, the private house when Goodwin is ringing doorbells trying to find one Herb Stempel. He never had to really do this. He went to the district attorney's office and they gave him 900 pages of grand jury minutes. And he knew exactly where I lived. He didn't have to question other people or ring doorbells or anything. But this particular scene was shot on 22nd Road in Astoria between 21st and 23rd Street. And every building along, this is a subliminal message, every building along the block, if you notice, this was 21-17. The numbers all along the block, of course, were 21, just like the name of the program. That's just a little subliminal thing. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Let me see if I can remember what I wanted to say here. For many, many years, you know, after this happened, I was teaching for many years too, and I'd walk into a school and my name got recognized, and the principal would say something like, "Oh, you're the guy who destroyed Charles Van Doren." And I would say, "I didn't destroy Charles Van Doren, he destroyed himself." He could have stepped forward at any time during these 2 or 3 years that these events took place and, you know, owned up to it, and he would have looked much better. Now, I always also get asked, have you ever spoken to Charles Van Doren since this happened? And the answer is no. He is a recluse. He lives up in Cornwall, Connecticut. He just turned 80, February 12th. He was born on Lincoln's birthday. His middle name happens to be Lincoln, and that's why I think they have that little piece in there about what do you think Honest Dave would be. Incidentally, the person who played Dave Garroway is Barry Levinson, who runs Baltimore Pictures, and the only way they could get him, Redford, to come over and direct the picture was to adopt a new script. There was originally another script, and this Paul Atanasio script was adopted. Let me tell you the final thing about the time Robert Redford was on a game show. This is quite interesting. My wife and I were on the set when they were shooting back in May of 1993 at 22nd Road, and we got invited into Redford's trailer, and he told us about the story he was on a game show, when he was on a game show. He was a 23-year-old kid in 1960 out of Santa Monica, California. His wife, Lola, worked in a bank on Wall Street. She was like 6 or 7 months pregnant, and she got fired. You had no protection back then, and she got out of shape. And he needed $75 to pay his rent, and he didn't have the money. A friend of his said to him, "We can get you on a Merv Griffin show called Play or Hunch." This was a show where they had like 3 curtains, and this contestant's twin brother was, for example, one of the people behind one of these curtains, and it obviously wasn't Bob Redford. So he comes out, Merv Griffin shook his hand and said, "Thank you very much for being on our show, Mr. Redford, and now for your present." Instead of the $75 which he needed to pay his rent, they trotted out a fishing rod from a Colombian fish, which he needed like the proverbial hole in the head. And he was fit to be tied, he said. At any rate, he scraped together the money, paid his rent. Many years later, he got a call from Merv Griffin, and Griffin said to him, "Bob, you've become a very successful actor. I'd love to have you come on one of my shows." And Redford said, he said to him, "If you could tell me the first time I ever appeared on television, I'll show up." And of course, Merv Griffin didn't have a clue. And Redford said, from that time on, he said, I was determined to make a show about a picture about game shows. And with that, I guess that's it. And I'll leave you folks.
One thing I'd like to add about, not specifically quiz show, but thank you, about film in general. There's a line in the South Park film, the opening number of the South Park film. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't remember the lyric, but kids are singing, and they said, "Off to the movies we will go, where we learn everything we know." You know, this is a really good film. I think it's really well made. I think there are interesting characters. I think John Turturro's character is probably more based on what your on-air persona that they were training you to be.
That's precisely so. As
Yeah.
a matter of fact, incidentally, you probably don't know this either, Mike, but 45 minutes was cut out of the film. It's actually a 3-hour movie, but they found it to be too cumbersome and too bulky. They cut out 45 minutes out of the movie, which sort of evens out. Instead of presenting me, it shows more of me and tries to balance more, but they decided they wanted to emphasize Van Doren, and they cut out three-quarters of an hour of the movie. So I'm really dying. I'd love to see the other three-quarters of an hour, but it's not available.
It's not on the DVD?
I don't believe so.
If I have come across it, I'll let you know.
You could check it out further, incidentally.
Yeah.
It was originally a 3-hour movie, that's my understanding.
But the individuals, the Herb Stempels and the Charles Van Dorens, are portrayed as pawns in a larger game. Rob Morrow's character, Goodwin, he was out to put television on trial, and it's almost like what we have today in television is now the result of him losing that battle.
That's very true. That's very true. As a matter of fact, I think Martin Scorsese, happened to have played a very good role. He's a good actor. Right?
Redford used a lot of filmmakers as little cameo roles. Huh?
Yeah. He was quite good. And Alan Rich as Kinder is quite good too. Yeah. He's a good character actor.
Yeah.
But as I said before, that NBC Peacock, of course, didn't exist at that time because this was black and white. And once again, what you sow is what you get. Let me tell you one more little thing. I did not lose on Marty. Everybody thinks I lost on Marty, but that's not the question I lost on. What happened was they were building up ties. It was $500 a point. They arranged for 4 or 5 ties. I was winning $69,500 at the time. They built up 5 ties to where it was $2,500 a point. It was not on Marty. The actual score was 16 to nothing. And had I answered the Marty question correctly, then history. But on the other hand, there wouldn't have been a scandal and there wouldn't have been a movie. So in the final analysis, I took the right path. It's strange to say. That's how fate works out. He would have been out of it, but at any rate, by taking the die, I went back to 11, and they arranged another tie. It was in the next game, there was a three-part question about newspapers, and you hear two of the three questions in the movie itself. Name a Kansas editor who died in 1944, a Pulitzer Prize winning editor. His name was William Allen White. You remember that name in the movie? Then what was the name of his newspaper? It was part 2. It was the Emporia Gazette, and it was on part 3 when I actually took the die. The name of the column in the newspaper, and it's the same as a book which just came out recently called What's the Matter with Kansas? That's the actual question I lost on. But of course, Marty is more dramatic because it's a picture, as is pointed out. And incidentally, this picture has some of the greatest lines that I've ever heard, because I'm not that witty as to think of some of these things. Like when my wife says, "You should worship the ground I walk on," and the reply is, "If you want to be worshipped, go to India and move." Funny line. And several other lines in there are quite good. But this Paulette, incidentally, we were nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Best Screenplay, Paulette and Nazio. Best Movie, Quiz Show, but we never had a chance. This was a Forrest Gump year, and nothing was going to beat Forrest Gump that year. The third one was Best Director, of course, Robert Redford, and the fourth was Best Supporting Actor, Paul Scofield, who played Mark Van Doren. And
Weren't you nominated for Best Consultant?
as a matter of fact, they never even put me in the credits as a consultant.
I was looking.
I know.
Yeah, for whatever reason, they left me off. Incidentally, it should say everybody votes me over. It's a bit of minutiae, though. I work for the Department of Transportation, New York City Department of Transportation, but it says Transit Authority, and all the people say to me, it says Herb, it says Transit. Who cares? It's really so irrelevant, you know?
Well, since, we mentioned the NBC logo a couple of times. That peacock logo is actually from, I think it started in the 62 or 63. The NBC chimes that were on the limousine that dropped you off,
Yeah.
that was, I think, the logo at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. As a matter of fact, I never came home in a limousine, and people were not, since I'll tell, have a few more minutes?
If you guys have to go, just slither out quietly. We're going to continue to talk.
Yeah. Okay. At any rate, the program, as I said before, was on until, started at 10:30, didn't finish till 11 p.m. When I came home, it could have been like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. I live in a development. It was absolutely like a morgue when I came home. There weren't people standing outside clapping and so forth and so on. But it's very expensive to shoot in the subways, and so they rented out a 58 automobile. You know, there were people who had all these cars, these stables of cars that they rented out, and they just slapped this NBC logo on it and had me come home by limousine. Also, as I said before, let me tell you one more thing. Richard Goodwin, the only time I ever spoke to Richard Goodwin in my life was he met me in front of NYU when I was going for my doctorate in 1960. And I spoke to him for like 2 hours, and I never saw him again until the premiere back in 1994.
And that was long after this was over.
Of course. Well, once again, this is Hollywood, you know. It's a lot of dramatic license. They're interested in what makes a good movie. Tell it bare bones the way it really happened. I appreciate this. I think it's a great movie. It deserved to be nominated and so forth. But being directly involved in it, you see it a little differently from just a spectator. Because I was involved in all of it. I could sit here, you know, for hours, which I won't do, and tell you about little dozens of minutiae mistakes and so forth. The light bird view and all that stuff. And that's about it.
I assume you're not into gambling.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, as I said before, only reason I went public on this is because he definitely promised me certain things, and then he looked me, I couldn't believe how Enright acted, you know, and he looked me in the eye and said to me, I don't know what you're talking about. He found himself at the gold mine, incidentally, and he was going to milk Pandora as much as he could. And incidentally, this business about a Jew and a Gentile, this is pure bunk. This is nonsense. Enright was Jewish, He died in 1992. Barry was Jewish. He got dead of a heart attack in 1984. So jogging in Central Park. It had nothing to do with ethnicity, religion, or anything. I was a poor, working class Bronx Jewish kid, you know. And Pandora was a personality, a prominent name. He was originally orphaned. He didn't come even take the test, incidentally. Al Friedman, the guy who ran to Mexico, in the Haggis area park, met him at a party in Greenwich Village, took him into the bedroom of his apartment, said this guy Herb Stempel was beating everybody to the detriment of the program, and we'll give you $5,000 if you come on the show and oppose him. And of course, he was given to understand right away the thing was rigged, you know. And he agreed right away. It wasn't this little mental duel he saw going on. But, however, you know, the funniest thing is I was on the Conan O'Brien show back in 1994, and I issued a challenge to him to play, you know, come out of seclusion and play me for charity anywhere, anytime in the United States and whatever. Of course, I got no reply. He happens to be, incidentally, a very, very excellent author. My grandson, who's studying to become a podiatrist right now, reads all his books. The only problem is when he used to go on these book shows, you know, to talk about his books, nobody wanted to talk about the books. They wanted to talk about the television show, and he was so embarrassed that he decided not to go on these shows anymore. But he happens to be an excellent author. No doubt he's a very brilliant guy and so forth, but he, like I, you know, needed the money, the prestige, whatever it turned out to be. And so he agreed to go on. Yeah. But as I said before, Enright was a consummate showman, but he really manipulated people, I mean, and he used people. We agreed to be used. I mean, we're just as guilty in that respect as he is. It isn't a question of innocence, guilt, or anything. It's a part of American history. Have any of you ever read a David Halberstam book called The 50s?
No.
You should rent this, get it out of the library. There's a whole chapter 43, devoted to the quiz show scandal. How did I come to get into this movie? I'll tell you. For many, many years, as I said before, I was sort of in the shadow, and I wouldn't give my story to anybody. About 1991, a producer named, a documentary producer named Julian Crane called me up, and he asked me if I'd like to take part in a documentary he was making about the scandals, and I told him yes. And this appeared on public television on PBS on Channel 13 at the beginning of 1992, and Disney picked up on this and decided to do a movie about this. As I said before, they had an original script, but then they decided to get Redford. They jumped the original script and took the one they had that you see in this movie.
Can I just ask you, is the PBS documentary available still?
Probably so, but it's called the Quiz Show Scandal, and as a matter of fact, in the montage you see in the beginning, when they're telling you over a wide network of affiliates and so forth, that comes right out of the documentary. And incidentally, if you in the beginning, when you see people running up the stairs at a subway and so forth, people, although this was at 10:30, not prime time, they had 50 million viewers. They had beaten even I Love Lucy, which was the #1 show at that time, because people were fascinated, because up till then, they had only had the $64,000 question on. That was the origination of the big money television shows. The $64,000 $64,000 question originated out of an older program called the $64 question. And then this producer, Louis Cowan, decided to multiply this by 1,000. And have any of you ever seen the $64,000 question? Any kinescopes or anything?
Yeah.
Okay. What happened in this was rigged too in its own way. What would happen was they used to pick people who had occupations which were entirely different from the categories they would answer. For example, a jockey who knew Shakespeare, or a
Wasn't Dr. Joyce Brothers one of the contestants?
Joyce Brothers was one of the contestants on there, and I'll talk about that in a second. They would make sure, though, that these people were zeroed in on their particular specialty. There was a guy named Gino Prado, who was a shoemaker, who won a whole bunch of money, $64,000 question on opera. But what they would do in this particular case is they would not give him German opera, French opera, Russian opera, only Italian opera. That's what he knew. And that was his expertise, and they zeroed in only on Italian opera. There was a Marine captain named James McCutcheon who knew cooking, not German cooking, not Italian cooking. He was an expert on French cooking. So they channeled every single contestant into a field which they knew, and all the questions would be based on having to question them over a period of time. They didn't give them the answers directly, but by Shirley Bernstein, incidentally, Leonard Bernstein's sister, who was also one of the people involved in rigging these programs, they would question them, find out what they knew, and simply regurgitate the things back to them. They didn't give them the answers, but they knew the answers. And that's how this worked.
So they'd find an area of expertise that a person had that was outside of what they did for a living.
That was directly opposite, as I said before, a jockey who would know Shakespeare, or Joyce Brothers, incidentally, knew the proverbial jack about boxing. At any rate, when she went out for an interview, they said to her, "Why don't you become an expert in boxing?" And she has a very prodigious memory too, and she boned up on boxing. And the strange twist of all of this is that Charles Revson, who owned Revlon, the cosmetics company at that time, disliked her intensely because she was what we call a plain Jane. She didn't wear makeup. And Revson was peed off about this because she didn't wear makeup and he wanted her dumped. So they threw a question at her. It was supposed to be about boxers. Who refereed a certain obscure fight at a certain particular time? And luckily, she knew the answer. And she won the maximum prize. But that's how they tried to torpedo her, because Revson wanted her off the air because she didn't wear makeup, because he had a cosmetic company.
One question getting back to the stylized version of the story in the movie, the guy Snodgrass, who registered
James
mail.
Snodgrass?
Is that a composite character, or how true to life is that?
No, James Snodgrass, let me tell you what happened here. Snodgrass was an artist who lived in Greenwich Village. For whatever reason, he was prompted, given the answers and everything, and he decided to write up the questions and answers, and his letter actually said something like, "I attended this meeting with Al Friedman or Dan. Dan Enright is the only person I know who handled me, and the rest of it was Friedman or other producers, but he personally handled me. At any rate, I was given the questions and the following questions, and he listened to questions and answers and mailed this registered letter to himself. When the investigation took place, they had experts examine what's known as the plug. On the back of a registered letter, there's a date stamp, and it says U.S. Post Office, and they determined, when they opened it up, this had never been tampered with, and this was the so-called smoking gun. They tried to smear him, obviously. Let me tell you also one other thing, which I neglected to mention. There was a goof-up on the program with me when I was forced to give an answer Enright told me to give, and it turned out wrong, and I knew it was wrong. He asked me, what's the name of the island that the Enola Gay took off from when it bombed Hiroshima? And I said, it's Tinian, T-I-N-I-A-N, in Marianas Islands. He says, well, my answer says Okinawa. I said, Dan, I said, it's Tinian. He says, when you get on the program, I want you to say Okinawa. So at any rate, I come on there and they ask me, what's the name of the island that the plane took off from to bomb Hiroshima? And I say Okinawa. And I was called right. Immediately the switchboard lit up. Bob Lewis, the co-pilot of the Enola Gay, who lived in Newark, New Jersey at that time, calls up. He says, it's Tinian, the 509th Composite Group, and we took off from Tinian. And they had to say, well, Jack Barry was looking at a wrong thing, you know, and they had the contestant that I beat come back the next week, and we ran the thing, and of course, I won again. Let me tell you about getting back to Snodgrass. When the reason he answered and gave the correct answer when you saw Jack Barry give the double take was as follows. He was an English major at the University of Maryland, and all his friends knew his favorite poet was Emily Dickinson. And according to what was supposed to be said, when they asked him about cat's feet and the fog and so forth, he was supposed to say Ralph Waldo Emerson. But he knew all his friends were watching, and he couldn't get himself to say Ralph Waldo Emerson. They ended up giving him the correct answer, Emily Dickinson, his favorite poet. And this, of course, created a complete mix-up in the schedule that they had. And right during the intermission, Enright came. I spoke to Snodgrass, that's how I know what happened. He came running down to the isolation booth and said, are you all right? Are you all right? You know, they were absolutely flustered because this threw everything out of gear. So I forget exactly how they got it resolved, but at any rate, the Snodgrass felt very hurt by this too, you know.
That double take, actually, I mean, the film, the way the film portrays it, you would have the impression that Jack Barry was in on it.
Let me tell you, Jack Barry, incidentally, I found out through the documentary, was in on it. I never accused him of anything. I told you the story about the category cards and everything, and I never directly, Enright, of course, I had worked with, so I said, Dan Enright, was Jack Barry involved? I said, I don't know, I have no first-hand knowledge of this. Back in 1992, when the documentary came out, Enright was on there, and he said, when we ran the program, what happened was, when they decided to fix it, according to what Enright says in the documentary, I've seen the original first kinescopes. They have two doctors on there, and for the whole program, they kept missing questions, and it ended up 0-0, and Jack Barry said, this is the funniest comedy show I've ever been involved in. And they got a call from the sponsor. He said, unless you jazz up this program, this is the Jericho guy, we're going to cancel you out. So he said, at that time, my partner and I decided to rig the program. So this was the first inkling that Barry was involved in it.
Jack Barry also hosted The Joker's Wild later on.
That's
right?
correct. And they made lots of money. As a matter of fact, I was on with Matt Lauer when the picture came out. He was a correspondent on Live at 5, and he said to me, doesn't it bother you that Jack Barry and Dan Enright made millions of dollars out of this and you didn't? I said, I'm alive. I said, both of them are dead. And that was my answer to that one.
I think everybody has to finally run. I know I have things back at the office. Thank you very much, Herb.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Anytime. Anytime to show us again.
Okay.